The first thing Jake noticed when he stepped out of the Heathrow Airport train station wasn't the weather. Even though the sky was the kind of gray that looked permanent, it wasn't the accents either. It was something much smaller, something subtle, something that made him pause for a second and think, wait, that felt different. He rolled his suitcase toward a small coffee stand inside the station and smiled at the woman behind the counter. "Hey, how's it going?" he asked in his usual American way. The woman blinked politely and replied, "Good morning." Jake nodded. "Good morning. Can I get a large coffee?" The woman tilted her head slightly. "A large," she repeated. Jake laughed a little. "Yeah, like a big one." She pointed to the cups. "We have regular slightly larger." Jake looked down at the cups and chuckled. "Haha, okay. Slightly larger it is." His friend Mark, who had been standing behind him with their luggage, leaned forward and whispered, "Did you notice that?" Jake shrugged. "Notice what?" Mark lowered his voice. "Everyone is calm." Jake glanced around the station. People were moving quickly, but quietly. No loud phone calls. No one shouting across the room. Even the announcements sounded strangely polite. Jake murmured. "Yeah, I guess." A man walking past accidentally brushed Jake's shoulder. Instantly the man said, "Sorry." Jake instinctively replied, "Oh, sorry." The man nodded again and said, "Sorry." They both stepped aside at the same time. "Sorry, sorry." Mark burst out laughing. "What just happened?" Jake shook his head. "I don't know. We apologized like 4 times." They stepped outside the station and waited near the curb. A taxi driver approached slowly. "Taxi?" he asked. Jake grinned. "Yes, please." The driver loaded their bags and asked, "Where to?" Jake pulled out his phone. Our hotel is near Covent Garden." The driver nodded. "Right?" The car pulled away smoothly. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. The driver focused on the road. Jake leaned forward slightly. "Busy morning?" he asked casually. The driver nodded once. "Yes." Then silence again. Jake slowly leaned back into the seat and whispered to Mark, "Okay." "That was shorter than I expected." Mark chuckled. In New York, that conversation would have lasted 5 minutes. Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, here it's like everyone is polite, but quieter." They watched pedestrians crossing the street, each person moving calmly, almost in rhythm with the city. Nobody seemed rushed, yet everything kept flowing smoothly. Mark scratched his head. "You know what this feels like?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "What?" Mark said. "It feels like everyone knows rules." "That we don't know yet." Jake stared out the window and laughed softly. "Ha ha, yeah. And I have a feeling we're about to break all of them." Jake and Mark dropped their bags at the hotel, freshened up, and decided the best way to fight jet lag was simple. Coffee. Real coffee. Or at least what Americans considered real coffee. They walked into a small cafe on a quiet street near Covent Garden, and Jake immediately smiled at the barista behind the counter. "Hey, how's your day going?" he said brightly. Kay the barista looked up, blinked once, and replied politely, "Not too bad, thank you." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Nice, nice. Yeah, good to hear." Then there was a pause. A slightly longer pause than Jake expected. The barista simply waited. Jake glanced at Mark and whispered, "Wait, did I ask too many questions already?" Mark shrugged. "Just order, man." Jake turned back to the counter. "Right? Sorry. Can I get a large latte?" The barista nodded and said, "Of course." Then she added, "That'll be £3.80. Jake tapped his card and stepped aside. As they waited, Mark leaned toward him. "Did you notice something?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Mark pointed subtly toward the door. A woman had just walked in and accidentally brushed past another customer. Instantly, both of them said the same word. "Sorry." The woman nodded. "Sorry." The other person replied, "Sorry." Jake laughed quietly. "Okay, this is becoming a pattern." First drinks arrived, and the barista slid the cups across the counter. "Cheers," she said casually. Jake picked up the cup and blinked. "Wait, cheers," he repeated. The barista nodded. "Yes." Jake smiled awkwardly. Oh, cheers. As they walked toward a small table, Mark chuckled. Did she just toast your coffee? Jake laughed. Haha, I think cheers means thank you here. They sat down near the window, watching people walk past outside. In 5 minutes, Jake heard at least 6 different people say sorry or cheers. Someone bumped into a chair. Sorry, a man squeezed past a table. Sorry. A woman handed a receipt to the cashier. Cheers. Jake leaned back in his chair and whispered, Wow. Americans say sorry too, but not like this. Mark nodded slowly. Yeah, we say it when something actually goes wrong. Jake pointed toward the sidewalk. Here it feels like social oil. Just then, the barista walked past their table collecting empty cups. Jake smiled at her again. Hey, quick question, he said. Do people here apologize a lot? The barista laughed softly. Oh, absolutely. Jake grinned. Even when it's not your fault? She shrugged slightly. Especially when it's not your fault. Mark blinked. Seriously? She nodded. It's just polite. Jake looked down at his coffee and chuckled. Huh. Back home, if someone bumped into me and apologized 3 times, I'd think they were nervous. The barista smiled. Or it just means they're being respectful. After she walked away, Jake leaned closer to Mark. Okay. So people apologize constantly, say cheers for everything, and keep conversations short. Mark nodded. Yeah. Jake took another sip of his latte and looked around the cafe again. Everyone seemed calm, friendly, and polite, but also slightly reserved. Nobody was chatting loudly with strangers. Nobody was oversharing. It was friendliness with a boundary. Jake tapped the table thoughtfully. Maybe we're being too American. Mark grinned. What does that even mean? Jake laughed. It means we talk too much. But neither of them realized yet that their next attempt at friendly American conversation was about to create a moment that felt even stranger. Later that afternoon, Jake and Mark decided to explore the city on foot. The streets around Covent Garden were busy but strangely orderly. People moved quickly, yet nobody seemed rushed. They stopped at another cafe stand near a small plaza, and Jake immediately spotted a man about their age sitting at a nearby table with a sandwich and a newspaper. Jake nudged Mark. Perfect, he whispered. Local conversation practice? Mark raised an eyebrow. Good luck. Jake walked over with his coffee and smiled. Hey, mind if we sit here? The man looked up from his paper and nodded politely. Not at all. Jake sat down and said cheerfully, Great weather today, right? The man glanced at the sky for a moment. Gray clouds hung low above the buildings. He said thoughtfully. Yes, not bad. Jake blinked. Not bad, he laughed. Where we're from, this would be considered kinda gloomy. The man folded his newspaper calmly. Ah, well. For London, this is quite nice, actually. Mark nearly choked on his coffee. Ha ha! Seriously! Jake leaned forward, excited to continue the conversation. So do you live around here? The man nodded. Yes. Jake waited. The man simply took another bite of his sandwich. Jake glanced at Mark, then back at the man. What do you do for work? The man wiped his hands and replied politely, I work in finance. Then silence again. Jake felt the pause stretch longer than expected. In the United States, this would usually be the moment when the other person asked a question back. But the man simply took another sip of his tea and looked relaxed. Jake whispered to Mark, Wait, am I interviewing him? Mark shrugged, trying not to laugh. Jake tried again. So, busy job? The man nodded slightly. Quay! Another pause followed. Jake leaned back and chuckled awkwardly. Haha, okay, I think I'm doing this wrong. The man looked curious. Doing what wrong? Jake gestured toward the table. Small talk. Back home, we usually go back and forth for a while. The man smiled politely. Ah, yes. Americans are very friendly. Mark laughed. That's a polite way to say we talk too much. The man chuckled quietly. Perhaps. A group of people walked past their table, and one of them accidentally brushed the back of Jake's chair. Sorry, the passerby said immediately. Jake nodded instinctively. Sorry. The man across the table smiled. You're adapting quickly, Jake laughed. Haha, I guess I am. He glanced around the plaza again. Several people were sitting at tables, but most of them were talking with friends they had arrived with. Very few strangers were starting conversations with each other. Jake tapped the table thoughtfully. You know, in the US you could sit next to someone at a coffee shop and end up talking for 20 minutes. The man nodded calmly. Yes, I've experienced that. Mark grinned. Did it surprise you? The man took a sip of tea. At first, yes. Jake leaned forward again, curious now. So here, people usually just keep to themselves. The man shrugged gently. Not unfriendly? Just respectful of space? Jake nodded slowly. Mark added, That actually explains a lot. Jake laughed. Yeah, I thought people were being distant earlier. The man shook his head. No. Just polite. Jake stood up and grabbed his coffee cup. Well, thanks for letting us sit here. The man nodded again. Not a problem. Jake hesitated for a second and then smiled. Cheers. The man smiled back. Cheers. As they walked away from the plaza, Mark laughed quietly. You really tried to interview that guy? Jake shrugged. Yeah, I was curious. Then he looked around at the calm streets again and said thoughtfully, But now I'm starting to understand something. Here, conversation works differently. Mark nodded. Yeah. Jake paused, then added with a grin, although we still haven't figured out the biggest mystery yet. Mark raised an eyebrow. What mystery? Jake pointed toward a long line of people outside a small bakery down the street. Why everyone here treats standing in line like it's a sacred ritual. Jake pointed toward the bakery across the street where a long, perfectly straight line of people stretched along the sidewalk. Nobody was talking loudly, nobody was pushing forward, and nobody seemed impatient. They were just standing there, calmly. Mark squinted at the scene. Wait, are all those people waiting for bread? Jake laughed. Ha! I guess it must be amazing bread. They walked closer, curious. The line curved neatly along the building, and every person seemed to know exactly where they were supposed to stand. Jake leaned toward Mark and whispered, Okay, this is easy. We just go inside in order. Mark shrugged. Yeah, seems simple. Jake stepped toward the bakery door and pulled it open. Immediately, he felt something strange behind him. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift in the air. A quiet pause. He turned around slowly. Every single person in the line was looking at him. Jake froze. Wait. Mark blinked. Why are they staring? A woman near the front of the line spoke gently but firmly. Excuse me. Jake smiled awkwardly. Oh, hi. She pointed politely toward the back of the line. The queue starts there. Jake glanced behind him and finally noticed the full length of the line stretching almost to the corner of the street. Oh, wow! He laughed nervously. Ha! Sorry, we didn't see it. The woman nodded. No worries. But the tone of the line behind her suggested something closer to, everyone saw it. Jake and Mark walked quickly toward the back of the line. Mark leaned over and whispered, You almost caused an international incident? Jake chuckled. Hey, nobody told us. A man standing ahead of them turned slightly and said calmly, In Britain, people take cues quite seriously. Jake raised his eyebrows. Yeah, I'm starting to notice. For a moment the line stood quietly again. Nobody complained. Nobody scolded them. But Jake could still feel the subtle social pressure of having accidentally broken a rule. He whispered, In the US, someone would have just yelled, Hey buddy, line's back here. Mark laughed. Yeah, Americans enforce rules loudly. The man in front of them chuckled softly. We prefer silent judgment. Jake laughed out loud. Haha, I felt that. The man nodded. The queue is sacred. Mark tilted his head. Sacred. The man shrugged slightly. Orderly. After a few minutes, the line moved forward. Every person stepped ahead smoothly, leaving just enough space for the next person. Nobody rushed. Nobody tried to sneak forward. Jake watched carefully now, almost studying the system. He murmured. This is like choreography. Mark nodded. Yeah, everyone knows the steps. A teenager walked up to the bakery and paused near the door, clearly unsure where to stand. Instantly, 3 people in the line gestured politely toward the back. Queue's back there. The teenager nodded quickly. Oh, sorry. Then he walked to the end. Jake whispered to Mark. See? That was gentle, but very clear. Mark grinned. It's like social radar. Finally, they reached the front of the bakery. The cashier smiled and asked, "What can I get you?" Jake ordered 2 pastries and stepped aside to pay. As they walked away with their food, Jake looked back at the line one more time and laughed. Okay. Lesson learned. Mark took a bite of his pastry. What lesson? Jake grinned. In Britain, you never skip the queue. Mark nodded. Seriously? Jake chewed thoughtfully for a moment, then added, but you know what's still confusing me? Mark raised an eyebrow. What now? Jake said. Everyone here is polite, calm, and organized. But sometimes I still can't tell when they're joking. Mark smirked. Oh yeah? Jake sighed. And I have a feeling that misunderstanding is about to get us into even more trouble. The next morning, Jake and Mark decided to visit a small pub that their hotel receptionist had recommended. It was the kind of place with dark wooden tables, quiet conversation, and a bartender who seemed to know half the people in the room. Jake stepped inside and smiled. Okay, this looks cozy. Mark nodded. Yeah, very British. They walked up to the bar and Jake greeted the bartender. Hey, how's it going? The bartender glanced up and said calmly, living the dream. Jake paused. Oh, nice! Mark leaned closer and whispered, wait, was that serious? Jake shrugged. I think so. Jake ordered 2 drinks and sat down at a nearby table. A local man sitting next to them glanced over and said, First time in London. Jake nodded enthusiastically. Yeah? Is it that obvious? The man smiled slightly. Just a little. Jake laughed. Ha ha, fair enough. Mark took a sip of his drink and looked around. Nice place, the man nodded. Yes, it's terrible. Mark blinked. Wait, terrible. The man took another sip of his pint and said casually, awful. That's why we all keep coming back. Jake stared for a second and then laughed. Oh, okay. That was sarcasm. The man grinned. You're catching on. Jake shook his head. Back home, someone would just say, it's a great place. The man shrugged. Where's the fun in that? Just then the bartender walked past and Jake said, this beer is really good. The bartender replied dryly, it's drinkable. Jake laughed again. Haha, that means good, right? The bartender nodded very. Mark leaned toward Jake and whispered, everything here sounds negative, even when it's positive. The local man overheard and chuckled. Yes, understatement is a national sport. Jake nodded slowly. Okay, so when someone says not bad, it means good. The man replied, often very good. Mark raised an eyebrow. Wow, Jake added, and when someone says quite good, the man tilted his head. That could mean average. Jake burst out laughing. Wait, seriously? The man nodded calmly. Language is complicated. A few minutes later, another customer walked in and greeted the bartender. All right, he asked. The bartender replied, all right. Then they both nodded and nothing else happened. Jake whispered, wait, was that the entire conversation? Mark grinned. I think so. Jake leaned toward the local man again. So all right means hello. The man nodded. Yes. Jake laughed. And the answer is also all right. The man nodded again. Exactly. Mark shook his head. Wow. Americans would think that conversation just started. The man smiled. Here, it's finished. Jake leaned back in his chair and chuckled. Ha ha! Okay, I'm starting to see the pattern now. He glanced around the pub again, listening more carefully to the conversations around him. People joked constantly, but almost never in a direct way. Compliments sounded like mild criticism. Sarcasm sounded completely serious. Jake tapped the table thoughtfully. You know what the funny part is? Mark raised an eyebrow. What? Jake said. At first I thought people here were being cold. Mark nodded. Same. Jake continued, but now I think they're joking half the time and we just don't recognize it. The local man lifted his glass slightly. Exactly. Jake laughed. Wow. Then he paused and added thoughtfully, but there's still one thing we haven't figured out. Mark looked confused. What? Jake gestured toward the quiet pub around them. Why everyone in public places here seems so calm and quiet. Mark nodded slowly. Yeah. Jake leaned forward and whispered, because I have a feeling if we act like Americans on a subway here, people might notice immediately. Later that evening, Jake and Mark decided to take the underground back toward their hotel. The entrance to the station was busy but strangely calm, almost like everyone had silently agreed on how to move. People walked quickly but neatly, flowing around each other like water in a narrow stream. Jake looked around and whispered, "Wow, this place is packed." Mark nodded. Yeah, but it's weirdly quiet. They stepped onto the escalator and Jake noticed something immediately. Everyone was standing on the right side in a perfectly straight line. The left side was completely open. Jake stepped onto the left side without thinking. Instantly, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me?" Jake turned around and saw a man waiting patiently. "Ooh, sorry," Jake said quickly as he stepped to the right. The man nodded and walked past. Mark chuckled. Lesson number 2. Jake shook his head. Stand on the right. They reached the platform where dozens of commuters were waiting. Yet the entire space felt calm. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was blasting music from their phones. Most people stood quietly, scrolling through their screens or reading. Jake leaned toward Mark and whispered, "In New York, this platform would be loud." Mark nodded. Very loud. The train arrived with a smooth hiss and the doors opened. Everyone stepped inside in an orderly way. Jake and Mark found a spot near the middle of the carriage and grabbed the overhead rail. For a moment, everything was completely silent except for the soft rumble of the train. Jake looked around and whispered, "Wait, is everyone whispering?" Mark shrugged. "I think so." Jake pulled out his phone and started telling Mark about a restaurant they had seen earlier. So this place had this huge sign outside and his voice echoed slightly in the quiet carriage. A few passengers glanced up for a moment. Not angrily, just briefly. Jake lowered his voice immediately. "Oh, wow." Mark smirked. "Yeah, you're the loudest person in this train." Jake laughed quietly. "Haha, that's embarrassing." Across from them, a woman closed her book and slipped on a pair of headphones. Another passenger shifted slightly to give someone more space. Nobody said anything, yet everyone seemed aware of the invisible boundaries around them. Jake whispered again. "Okay, I think I get it now." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What?" Jake said. "People here respect quiet space." Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's like a shared agreement." A man standing nearby overheard them and smiled politely. "It's just considered courteous," he said calmly. Jake nodded. "Right." The man added, "People have long days. The commute is often the quiet part." Jake chuckled softly. "Makes sense." Mark leaned toward him and whispered, "Imagine someone blasting music on speaker right now." Jake winced. Wow. Everyone would stare. The man beside them smiled. Yes. For a moment, the train continued moving through the tunnel while the passengers remained calm and quiet. Jake watched the reflections in the window and thought about everything they had noticed since arriving in London. Constant apologies, the sacred cues, the dry humor, the calm public spaces. He whispered thoughtfully, "You know, at first, all these things felt strange." Mark nodded. "Yeah." Jake continued, "But now I think they're all connected." Mark tilted his head. "How?" Jake smiled slightly. "It's all about respecting other people's space." Mark nodded slowly. The train slowed as it approached the next station, and Jake looked around at the quiet passengers once more. "The funny thing is," he said quietly, "the more we understand the rules, the more this place actually makes sense." Mark grinned. "Yeah." Jake chuckled and added, "And now I'm starting to realize something else." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What?" Jake said, "We might actually start acting like locals if we stay here long enough." The next morning, Jake and Mark walked out of their hotel with a different kind of awareness. The city hadn't changed overnight, but the way they were observing it had. Jake paused at the corner of the street as a woman accidentally brushed past him. Instantly, he heard himself say, "Sorry." The woman replied automatically, "Sorry." Mark burst out laughing. "Wait, did you just do it?" Jake looked confused. "Do what?" Mark pointed at him. "You apologized. Instinctively." Jake paused for a second and then laughed. "Ha ha! Wow, that just happened." They crossed the street and stopped at a small cafe they hadn't noticed before. Jake stepped up to the counter and this time he kept things simple. "Morning," he said. The barista nodded. Morning. Jake ordered his coffee and the barista slid the cup toward him. Cheers. Jake picked it up and replied without thinking. Cheers. Mark shook his head. You're adapting fast. Jake grinned. Hey, I'm learning the language. They sat down near the window and watched the street outside. A man approached the door of the cafe, paused for a moment, and then stepped aside to let another customer exit first. After you, he said politely. Jake nodded toward the door. See that? Mark nodded. Yeah, Jake said quietly. Everyone is constantly negotiating space. Mark took a sip of his coffee. Yeah, but nobody talks about it. Jake leaned back in his chair. Exactly. That's the part that confused us at first. He glanced around the cafe again. People were chatting softly with friends, reading newspapers, typing on laptops. Nobody seemed stressed or rushed. Everything moved with a kind of quiet rhythm. Jake chuckled softly. You know what I thought on our first day? Mark raised an eyebrow. What? Jake said. I thought people here were distant. Mark nodded. Same, Jake continued, but they're not distant. They're just subtle. Just then, the same man from the bakery queue the previous day walked into the cafe. He noticed Jake and Mark and smiled. You survived the queue yesterday, Jake laughed. Barely, Mark added. We learned our lesson. The man nodded approvingly. Good, Jake gestured toward the empty chair at their table. Want to join us? The man sat down briefly and said, So, how are you finding London now? Jake thought for a moment. Honestly, it's starting to make sense. The man smiled. Ah. Jake continued. At first, everything felt confusing. People were polite but quiet. Conversations were short. Humor was hard to read. Mark added, and we almost caused a bakery riot. The man chuckled. Jake leaned forward slightly. But now, I think we understand the system. The man tilted his head. System? Jake nodded. Yeah. Everyone here is constantly making space for other people. In lines, on trains, in conversations. Mark added. It's like social choreography. The man smiled. That's a good way to describe it. Jake looked out the window again where pedestrians moved calmly along the sidewalk. It's not that people aren't friendly, he said thoughtfully. They just show it differently. The man stood up to leave and said, Well, enjoy the rest of your stay. Jake nodded. Cheers. The man replied, Cheers, and walked out. Mark leaned toward Jake. You know something funny? Jake looked at him. What? Mark grinned. If we went back to the US right now, we might feel the opposite culture shock. Jake laughed. He looked around the cafe one more time and said quietly, Funny how the things that felt strange at first end up making perfect sense once you understand the rules. On their final afternoon in London, Jake and Mark were sitting in a small park near the river, watching people pass by along the walkway. A street musician played softly nearby while tourists wandered past with cameras and shopping bags. Jake leaned back on the bench and said, You know what's funny? Mark glanced over. What? Jake chuckled. When we arrived a few days ago, I thought something about this place felt off. Mark laughed. Yeah, remember the airport coffee? Jake nodded.
Yeah.
I asked the barista how her day was going, and she looked at me like I'd just asked a philosophy question. Mark smirked. And then there was the taxi ride. Jake nodded again. Right. I kept waiting for the driver to start chatting, and he just drove. They watched a couple walk past pushing a stroller. The father accidentally bumped a bicycle leaning against the railing. Instantly, he said, Sorry. Even though nobody else had touched it, Jake pointed and laughed quietly. There it is again. Mark grinned. The apology reflex. Jake shook his head with a smile. At first I thought people here were nervous or overly cautious. Mark nodded. Same, Jake continued. But now I think it's just how people keep everything running smoothly. Mark stretched his legs out and said, Yeah, it's like social lubrication. Jake laughed. It is the most American way to describe British politeness. A man walking his dog paused near their bench and asked, Lovely day, isn't it? Jake glanced up at the cloudy sky and replied instinctively, Yeah, not bad. The man smiled and continued walking. Mark turned slowly toward Jake with a grin. Wait, did you just say not bad? Jake blinked. Oh, wow. I did. Mark burst out laughing. You're officially halfway British now. Jake chuckled. Give me another week, and I'll be saying quite all right to everything. For a moment they sat quietly, watching the steady flow of people along the path. Nobody bumped into each other. Nobody shouted. Everyone seemed aware of the invisible bubble around the people next to them. Jake finally said, You know what travel really does? Mark shrugged. What? Jake said, It shows you that the way things work at home isn't the only way they can work. Mark nodded thoughtfully. Yeah. Jake continued. Back in the US, we show friendliness through openness. We talk to strangers, we start conversations, we laugh loudly. Mark added, Here they show respect through restraint. Jake looked out toward the river and nodded slowly. Exactly. Different style, same goal. Mark raised an eyebrow. What goal? Jake smiled. Making life easier for the people around you. A group of tourists walked past speaking loudly, clearly confused about directions. Several locals glanced over briefly, not annoyed exactly, just curious. Jake chuckled quietly. Ha ha! That was us 2 days ago. Mark nodded. Yep. Jake stood up from the bench and stretched. All right, I think I've learned the rules now. Mark stood up too. Let's hear them. Jake raised his fingers one by one. Rule 1, never skip the queue. Mark nodded. Correct. Jake continued. Rule 2, keep your voice down on trains. Mark grinned. Very important. Jake added. Rule 3, when someone says something that sounds negative, they might actually mean the opposite. Mark laughed. British sarcasm. Jake nodded. Exactly. They started walking toward the street when Jake paused and added one more thought. Oh yeah. Mark turned. What? Jake smiled. Rule 4. Mark waited. Jake said, if you accidentally bump into someone, just say sorry. Mark laughed. Even if it wasn't your fault. Jake shrugged and grinned. Especially if it wasn't your fault.